hear some noise. I don't know what it is. It's like almost something clicking.
Flicking.
Are you wearing any like jewelry, bangles?
You know what it is? It's my cat attacking a toy. If you're
Oh,
hearing, because it sounds like a bangle. Hold
ah,
on, let me stop him from doing that. 1 second.
okay. Oh my God. Oh,
Okay. What about now?
it's gone.
Okay. Okay.
Welcome to Immigrantly, Delsy. So first of all, this is happening. It is happening finally. So how long have we been at it? Like, how long have you and I been communicating for? I don't even
I
remember
think
now.
several months, maybe a couple of months.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And it's so interesting to me because I have interviewed Brenda, Anna Shayla, and now I'm interviewing you. So I feel like I have this very strong connection with Tamarindo Podcast and all awesome, phenomenal women there. So I'm really glad we are having this conversation. And then you have a cat. I mean, come on. It's so good. So good.
Thank you for sticking with it. It's just a testament to how busy lives have become that it's hard to mesh two different schedules where people are doing a lot of things and extra projects and all of that. But it makes me happy that you're mentioning some of these women because they've been a big part of my life the past few years. And so I'm excited to connect with you.
I am so excited to connect with you as well. I've been listening to Tamarindo for a long time. I was a big fan when Brenda and Anna Shayla were co-hosting it, and um, I went back and listened to it as, you know, one of the co-hosts being you now. And it's same incredible stories. Again, I feel like Immigrantly and Tamarindo has such strong connection in terms of how we are doing storytelling. Um, but Delcy, before we get into the podcast and your work and your healing journey, let's take a step back and start from the very beginning. Talk to me about where you were born, raised, your childhood memories.
Yeah, so I am the child of two pretty spectacular people. They're both Guatemalan, and they came to the United States in the 80s during a civil war that was taking place in Central America that a lot of people are aware of. And Guatemala had its own version of that civil war, which made life in Guatemala really difficult. My parents had my older sister, and they were struggling to survive, specifically because they were targeting people who were in universities. And so my dad at the time was going to school. And so he had a lot of fear and a lot of things that were going on during that time. So they came to the United States, and I was born the year that they arrived. So this was,
Ah,
we kind of already starting in an interesting place because my parents were undocumented at the time. They were in a new country, obviously didn't speak the language, didn't have a job here in this situation. And all of a sudden, my mom is pregnant, right? um, and she tells this story in a way that really puts my life in context because it wasn't a an exciting thing, right? It was a scary
yeah.
thing that there was this additional life that was coming during that time. And so I think um it's a good place to start. We lived in East Los Angeles, and I grew up there in the 90s. And it was this really incredible way of growing up because I was right in the middle of a big moment in Los Angeles history, right? We had like Rodney King riots during that time. There was a big, big focus on gang life during that time, and also a lot around kind of media attention of Latinidad in general during that time. And so I grew up in this very interesting dynamic where I was sort of aware that it wasn't necessarily a good thing to be Latin in the United States. And one of the things that was very interesting was that my family, as a result of their background, didn't really talk to me a lot about anything that had to do with politics, right? It was something that sort of nobody wanted to discuss. It was a very, I think, sensitive topic. So it was not something that was talked about in the household. But one thing that I remember very clearly is I would see the murals when we were driving in LA, in East LA. I would see all of these big murals from all these really important artists, right? Judith Baca, for example, or the We Are Not a Minority mural. And I remember it was the first time that I had any consciousness around political activism as Latinos, or the fact that there were other opinions out there about who we were. It was the first time. And I think that is the moment where I fell in love with art and I wanted to know more. And from that point forth, I think it was the main thing that I paid attention to, is anytime there was some form of expression.
Delsy, I love what you're talking about. But before we talk about art, I want to go back to what you said about your parents, right? They weren't talking to you about politics. And I hear this from a lot of kids of immigrants, that their immigrant parents are not open about certain conversations. And being an immigrant parent, it really makes me pause and think about the conversations that I should have had with my kids, I should have with my kids. But going back to politics, what is it that you wish your parents had spoken about, discussed with you regarding politics?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I look back at that time with a whole lot of empathy for my parents. Because right now I am at the age that my parents maybe would have been during a lot of my early memories, right? And I realize life is incredibly difficult and especially as you get older. And when I think about their circumstances, I understand why this wasn't even an idea to talk to me about. I think if it would have been helpful for me to understand a little bit more about the history of Latinos in Los Angeles, right? I would have liked to have known a little bit more about that, specifically the impact. And I think one of the things that I remember really clearly was going to Hollywood. This was something that we never really did these kinds of things, but every now and then we would go out and do something, and we would go to Hollywood, and there was this huge mural of the actor Anthony Quinn, and he's sort of dancing, and it was one of the first times that I saw like a Latino face in a prominent part of Los Angeles, and made me realize that we had more history beyond the history that I was living in. And I think that would have been helpful. I'm not sure my parents had that context, but it would have.
That's what I was
helpful.
going to say. Because as an immigrant, when I look back, our initial years of settling down in the US were so chaotic, right? And even now, I don't have context for a lot of things because I did not grow up here. I did not, experience my childhood in the US. I did not experience my early teenage years in the US. So for me to contextualize what Muslim identity looked like in the 80s and the 90s, or what it looks like and how much of it has changed or evolved, is very difficult, right? Do you see that now, that your parents probably didn't have the vernacular or the knowledge
definitely
to have that conversation?
Definitely. I think I knew it all along, right? And I think when I say I wish I would have known, I don't necessarily think that it needed to have come from them. I think that there were many opportunities, in school, for example, is a really great example, being
Yeah.
that we were primarily Latinos in the school would have been an interesting way to contextualize history. But I do think that that's why the artists in the neighborhood were up to the task, because I think there was some
Right.
understanding of that these were immigrant communities, and we were not the first to come. There was just a massive wave of people from Central America that came during the same time. But what was interesting about that too is like my parents were all of a sudden in a primarily Mexican environment. And so I
Yeah.
know people think like, oh, well, everybody's Latino, but that's really not what their experience was. They had come from this very homogenous country, aside from, the incredible amount of indigenous tribes and communities that exist in Guatemala. They had come from a generally homogenous culture from the area of Guatemala that they were from. And then all of a sudden, they're in this space with people who are coming from an entirely different country. So I grew up with all of my friends being Mexican American. And so it is an interesting experience because I didn't actually meet another Guatemalan person who was my age, who was not a member of my family, until I was almost, 17 years old, maybe.
Oh, how did that shape your outlook on life in general?
I think that it made me feel like there was something to discover all the time, because I didn't have access to my pieces of my identity. They weren't easily there, right? So I had my parents, and now that I'm older, I realize that my parents kind of functioned within a little bit of a time capsule.
That.
Like when you talk to my parents, even the language that they use, they're using like 70s slang. When they're speaking in Spanish, they're using 70s slang. The music they listen to is from the 70s. Like they basically, the moments of their life that were most joyous were their early 20s. And so they relive those moments over and over in the culture of the household. And at the time, I just assumed that was Guatemalan culture because they were my only avenue to Guatemalan culture. And
Oh my
now in
gosh, I love it.
context,
I love
you
what you're
know,
talking about. It's
yes,
so, it's true line in every immigrant household. I feel like I'm stuck in early 2000s when I think about Pakistan. I haven't moved on. I haven't.
and what a great opportunity because, for me, I get to engage with Guatemalan culture as it exists today when I am there through my cousins and through people that I connect with who are in the country now, and Guatemalan-Americans that are coming to the United States right now and what that culture looks like. And I also have a very clear window into Guatemala of the past because my parents kept it alive so strongly, and it's a
What
really
are some
beautiful
of
time.
what are some of the differences between the culture of the 70s and the 80s that you saw growing up in your household versus what you're seeing as an adult?
My parents in the 70s and 80s are what they have brought to the table is a big sense of community, a lot of collective sort of joy. There was a lot of, and obviously, let's be clear, I don't want to make it a utopia because, there are dynamics within large groups of people, right? And gossiping and family drama and all those things. But there is this kind of goal everybody has to ensure that they're always together. And it seems like everybody has this goal. I have seen that shift a lot in newer generations as they kind of take on a more like hyper capitalist experience like we're living. There's a lot of working and a lot of trying to achieve and so on. And so it becomes a more and more individual lifestyle. So that's something that I'm seeing a lot of. And I think also the openness that newer generations have to other parts of the world that may not be Eurocentric. So my parents came from a very Eurocentric existence.
Interesting.
Everything that they liked or listened to often came from Spain or, from other European countries. And I notice now with my cousins and people, they're really into like norteño music or, sometimes music from India. And it's really cool to see sort of like indigeneity taking more of a forefront in the identity. And I think that's really beautiful.
What I'm hearing is that in this new culture, what's gained is more international global perspective and inclusive approach to human existence. And what's lost in some ways is the idea of community and collectivism, which older generations really held close to their hearts and celebrated in a way. So,
Yeah.
what what is the balancing act in this, Delsy?
It's interesting because I'm only speaking as a person from the outside looking in, right? Which is that I'm commenting on what people in the country of origin or from the country of origin are thinking and doing. But I think when you talk about balance, a really good way to think about that is to think about somebody like me, because
Hmm.
I am a holder of both of these cultures in one space, and also this American identity, right? And so there's a lot of this balance where I'm part of a new generation of Guatemalans, and I'm also, somebody that grew up with my family kind of in this time capsule of that was our home, that I'm so joyful and happy to have been a part of. And there's also this new sense of self as a Latino, as a collective Latinidad, that and in general as a first generation American or part of a BIPOC community. And I do exist kind of in that balance, in that in between,
Hmm.
that is ever evolving. And I think that is the theme of what it is to have this mix of identities, is that you are not stagnant. There really isn't a moment where you can say, this is who I am now, and you hold on to it. It seems to be in a constant flux. And
Hmm.
the openness and flexibility that you have to understand that you are Latina because that's who you are. And it is not necessarily something you need to do or something you need to achieve or something you need to follow, but
Hmm.
rather like who I decide to become and who I evolve to be is what Latinidad is as a result.
That's your idea of who you are, right? But I wonder, how do others, especially those living in Guatemala, people who are local, perceive you?
I think that that's something that is changing a lot. When I was younger, I think there was a very clear divide, right? Which was,
Hmm.
it didn't feel like I was Guatemalan in any way, which I can understand because I don't know, a lot of the common knowledge, like this certain slang words or even neighborhoods or any context to schools or any of the conversations that
Hmm.
people would have. Even some of the major uh, political things that have gone on, or maybe entertainment artists and things, like I wasn't super in the know. I did my best, but I wasn't 100% local. I mean, you can tell I have an accent when I speak Spanish. I speak a lot of Spanglish, all of that. And I think there was a little bit of a sense that I was foreign to them, although they were kin to
Hmm.
me, which is a very interesting experience because I felt foreign in the US, although I was born here. And so I sort of felt foreign no matter where I went. And I think that's a common feeling that people who are like me experience. I will say that recently, because of the advent of the internet, right, and kind of the expansion of globalization, and also just the way that English has taken over the world, there are now a lot of young Guatemalans speak fluent English.
Right.
Um, I have noted that the gap is sort of not culturally not as prominent. My cousin
Hmm.
who's my age is living a similar lifestyle to me, and we use similar slang words, and she speaks English, and we're listening to similar music because a lot of the music that she's listening to is no longer Eurocentric. And as a Latina in the US, I listen to a lot of Latin music. And so the gaps are starting to narrow, and as a result, I think we're gaining more commonality, and there's a little bit less of that rejection.
Do you see any places or paths where these multiple identities clash?
Yes, absolutely. I think,
Mhm.
one of the things that is very interesting is I'm a big proponent, right, for therapy. And a lot of what happens when you are in therapy is really thinking about you, who you are, what you need to thrive, right? And sometimes that it means being an individual and thinking about yourself in a way that maybe I'm not programmed to do. And so there can
Hmm.
be this kind of balance where as I start to establish boundaries or I start to really think about who I want to be and who I want to spend time with, it becomes more challenging to comply with some of the cultural standards that I was raised with and sort of having to be okay with feeling nervous about maybe being perceived as selfish or even judging myself as maybe not being helpful enough to the collective. I think is the major battle that goes on within me.
Let's expand this conversation a little. I was listening to one of your episodes, and you talked about decluttering your life, right? You at the time were in the process of decluttering. Um, Talk to me about that. Have you been able to declutter parts of your life? And do you have any regrets about what you've let go of in the process?
I think, one of the things that's important to know is that I have felt a lot of empowerment this year. I think because it's been one of the hardest years of my life, in all honesty. And I think when you have a lot of difficulties and a lot of challenges, it sort of forces you into this place of growth, which I think has
Hmm.
taken me all year to come into that awareness and gratefulness around that process. Because earlier in the year, I was sort of like, why is this happening? But now I feel very aware of it. But that I answer that just to answer the part of your question around regret, because I realize that I am fully in control of my life, which I don't think I was aware of before. And as a result, if I do something, if I make a decision that I don't feel good about, it's totally fair game for me to
Hmm.
change it and to try again. And the people who have patience to be with me through that journey are the people that I want in my life, right? So I try to make these changes with a lot of grace and a lot of empathy and care. And, I don't always get it right, but I want to make sure that people feel cared for, even if they don't understand the decisions that I'm making, because the decisions that I'm making really, they're for me at this point in my life.
Hmm.
They're for
Hmm.
me. And I think it's the first time that I do that. I When I thought about decluttering my life, it was really about like, why am I feeling so overwhelmed by my own decisions, by my life, by the amount of people in it, or the things that I do when those choices have been made by me? And so thinking
Hmm.
through having a very clear sense of like, how do I want to feel every day? How do I want to feel when I spend time with this person? When they're around me, how do I want to feel? And I want to feel, I want peace and I want joy and I want connection. And I think narrowing it down made it easier for me to say, okay, I'm alert now. And if I'm feeling uncomfortable, if I'm not feeling that peace, that joy, that connection, then is this worth my time? And
Hmm.
that is really hard because sometimes, these are people who've been in your life for a long time. Sometimes they're activities that you went after. Sometimes they're plans that you yourself set up, and you're having to figure out how to respectfully back away from those moments to allow more time and space for what you really want to invite. And it's a
Hmm.
really difficult, painful experience. Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen this in your therapy as well, right? You are a therapist and you work with other people, and you probably have these deeper conversations around vulnerability. And it seems like you've put yourself in those situations as well. But Delsy, I want to go back to what you said about you being in full control of who you are and what you can do and what you should do in a way. Right? Do you think that's putting a lot of burden on yourself?
Yes, I do think that there are obviously systems in place and a lot of history, especially with my background and who I am. There are a lot of things that are either by design or just
Hmm.
happen to be the case, or become kind of collateral damage after other schemes have been employed, right? There's a lot there that puts this massive barrier in front of me, or I think I see those as the current playing field, and I do a lot of work on my end to sort of fight against those systems. Or Tamarindo, for example, is one big way that I engage in sort of like
Hmm.
activism and social justice and so on. It's a lot of my own voluntary time to kind of address these things. But I think when I think about how much agency I do have, it is pretty astonishing, because
Huh.
despite those systems, there are many kind of everyday decisions that I do have control over, that I, for a long time, um, sort of allowed to be decided by other people, or even perceptions of other people that maybe weren't even accurate, you know? Because one thing that's really cool is, as you get to know your parents and your family and your culture more and more as you get older, you realize like these people are not stagnant. They also
Yeah,
change, but sometimes our
absolutely.
perceptions of them are
Remain
slow to
static.
catch up. Yes.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
even things that I've thought, God, my mother's going to kill me if I do this, and then I go talk to her and she's like, "What? I love it. Let's do it." And I'm like, "What is happening?" And she's using new words and I'm like, "What's going on?" And it's amazing.
I hear you. It's as if we put our loved ones in this static space, or we see them sacrosanct, especially our parents, right? We don't see them as humans who have emotions and who are living life, and their life experiences teach them so much and helps them evolve. But I'm curious to know, how does this wiring happen? How do humans change, Chelsea? And I want you to wear your therapist hat, because changing one's habits and character is not easy, right? And I'm always curious to know, is it shame, a seismic event, um, love, connection? What triggers change in humans?
There are so many theories of change, and so many ways to go about it. Everything you mentioned, the answer would be yes. There's so many
Hmm.
catalysts for change. I think what's interesting, and an interesting way to think about this question, is more so what obstructs you from change would be maybe easier to
Ah,
answer, because I think there's a lot of self-doubt and perceptions, and maybe some older schemas, right? Ideas, ways of thinking about the world that kind of hold you in where you are. And sometimes that's for survival purposes, right? Like you're not able to continue on because you're just sort of trying to like stay afloat. Um, and I think when you're either forced to into change, or you are open to change because the circumstances of your life have allowed you to enter that state where you're open to difference, I think that it can be exponential from that point. And to tie it into what we were talking about and using a personal example, because my mother came from Guatemala, she has never doubted that she is Guatemalan. And
ah, yeah.
as a result, she has actually changed and grown and altered her perceptions of the world drastically by allowing kind of the US to wash over her, because she wasn't holding on to this idea of what it meant to be Guatemalan. But me, on the other hand, because I was not born in the country and I didn't actually grow up around Guatemalans, I felt like I needed to be Guatemalan. And so I created this idea, a very
Yes.
stagnant idea of what it was to be Guatemalan. And I went full force into it. And as a result, I stayed within those parameters for a very long time and did not seek out some of the things my mother has sought out. And I think recently kind of understanding these dynamics, that they're very common, that lots of people have the same experience as me, and letting some of that go and understanding who I could be, I have seen that barrier lifted and lots of change kind of take place.
What was the trigger for you personally?
I think for me, the trigger, for me, I think it really was like health related issues, because, you can put up so much pressure on yourself and your body can only take it for so long. And I think when I started to realize that I was having maybe like somatic responses to a massive level of stress, I sort of started to examine that stress further. And some of that stress really was stemming from what I perceived to be my culture. Only to understand that it, was a culture that I had designed. And maybe was not the reality of how the culture presents.
Give me an example of your perception of your culture and the reality as you see it now.
So a really good example is like the femininity in my culture. So gender roles in my culture, for example, growing up, I felt what I thought was a lot of pressure to sort of dress in dresses all the time. And as I got older, high heels and lots of makeup. And, there's a lot of pressure to dye your hair, maybe a lighter color because of colorism and all of these different things. Yeah. And I felt a lot of pressure to like look this way or present this way or make sure that I had a certain level of femininity that was appropriate for other people and so on. And I think, that doesn't sound like a big deal to a lot of people maybe listening, but for me, identity wise, it felt like I was in a constant costume. I was, in some kind of like parody of myself. It didn't really feel authentic to me. And so as I got older, I started kind of playing more with what I wore and how I expressed, my gender and so on, and the kind of woman that I felt that I was. And I really believed that this would be like, chaos. If I went somewhere dressed how I wanted to dress, that people would say things or it would be, I wouldn't be accepted or whatever. And I realize now that there's so much more flexibility. And although I do think that ideal standard is still something that exists within the culture, I realize that the people who care about me, love me, know me, support me, are not necessarily holding my value to this particular cultural idea of gender. And so I have the capacity to be more me and to appear the way I want to appear and what makes me comfortable, confident, and able to kind of face the world as dressed as myself and not as the version of myself that I think the culture responds to.
Delsy, have you had these conversations with your mother?
A little bit here and there. My mom and I have lots of really intense conversations. And this conversation has gone there a couple of times, mostly when she'll make comments, everybody knows about the mom comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a mom. I make those comments. I try not to. I'm seriously, guys, I'm being very intentional now. But I am curious to know how your mom perceives your understanding of how you present yourself and your gender now through what you wear and how you dress up.
I think that, when I think about how she perceives what I'm wearing, for example, it's like everything is coded in all of these layers of like generational trauma, right? Where she wants me to look like a professional, like feminine woman, because this is what in the 70s in Guatemala was considered a respectable person that was treated as a respectable class, because there's a very almost like a caste system that goes on there. And being a Latina in the US, she's fully aware of how I am already perceived when I enter a room. So she is almost like in a protective stance, like, make sure you always look, appropriate. Make sure you always look this way so that no one is having any thoughts about you and everyone treats you with respect. She's coming from that place. And that's giving her a lot of credit, because I think there are also some other reasons and you can imagine that why she would want to control how I dress. But I think now she's sort of understanding more and more that for me, the power is coming more from within. And the way that I feel about my life and myself, because we've had these conversations. And so I'm not dressing for others. I am dressing for me. And I think that the way people perceive me, is impacted by how I perceive myself and how I'm entering a room, because I can't really adjust for what other people might want.
So how changing your dressing has changed your others' perception of who you are? Have you noticed that change from other people?
I feel like I've noticed other people less and less, which is big in and of itself. It's also telling in and of itself, because as I shift my mind state from thinking about what others might think of me to thinking about what I think of myself, it has completely changed the way I am living in the world.
What do you think of yourself?
I have quite a lot of care for myself in an external way that I think I didn't have before. Mostly like understanding myself as part of the human condition. I don't think I extended as much care or grace as I did to other people, right? If my family member, to myself, if a friend was going through something, or if somebody I met, was behaving a certain way or whatever, there was a lot of grace. If my family didn't understand something or did XYZ, there was a lot of grace. But for me, there wasn't that same grace. It was like I expected myself to hit a standard that was really impossible in a lot of ways, and checked too many cultural boxes. Like, be the best American, like be the best Latina, be the best, daughter, mother, be the best at work, be the, and now I'm sort of seeing myself in context as like, this is what it is to be a human being. And I am in a constant state of confusion and figuring things out. And that doesn't change with age. I get older and I'm still as lost, right? And I think,
which is not bad.
Yeah, it's the human experience.
Confusion is good. Confusion leads to evolution, right?
Yes.
It leads to discovery and curiosity. So there's nothing wrong with confusion. We don't need to have all the answers all the time.
Yes. And I think there was this idea for me that sort of like, if you did everything right, one day you woke up and it was all figured out. And now I'm coming to the conclusion that that's not the case, and that it's actually quite beautiful that that isn't the case, that there isn't kind of this like final destination, but rather like a constantness, this constant experience of being alive. And seeing myself in that context has given me a lot of grace and almost a little bit of admiration for myself, in the sense of like, man, like you have ridden the wave, right? Like you're kind of coming out the other side of a lot of things this year. And that same admiration that I have for other people that I see in the world who are living through a whole lot, and still kind of maintaining that level of curiosity about the world.
You've granted it to yourself.
Yeah.
Wow. Delsy, I want to circle back to what you said in the beginning. Art as a healing tool, right? We started the conversation there, how art became this tool for you to connect with your identity, to connect with yourself. If someone were new to exploring art as a healing tool, what's one unexpected exercise or activity you would recommend to them as a healer, as a therapist, that offers instant insight or relief through art?
I would say that not thinking of art as a proper noun is
Hmm.
life-changing, right? When you think about art, you hear the word art, I think a lot of people think of institutions or, museums. Maybe they think of a formal practice or an formal education when it comes to art, or they're thinking about like world-renowned, the Michelangelos
Artist.
of the world. And that is a massive barrier, because if you're thinking of art that way, then immediately you're out of the running unless you're some kind of genius or
You're
prodigy.
right.
But I think that artistic being, artistic thinking, creative thinking is a human right. And it is a human, almost like something that has gotten passed down, like a human tradition, right? And you don't need to create. You don't need to put anything on a paper. You don't need to go buy supplies and like figure out how to use them. You certainly can, and it's fantastic if you do. But simply letting your mind wander and be
Hmm.
allowing yourself what we call boredom, right? Allowing yourself to enter a state where you are perceiving things you've seen a million times in a different way, noticing their shape, noticing their form, noticing how they make you feel, what they make you think
Yeah.
about. I think letting yourself have that kind of creative thinking that comes naturally to some and maybe is like a practice for others, and maybe tied into mindfulness, can be really powerful. And it can, I think, generalize in other areas of your life when you allow your brain to like recognize those kinds of connections, right? And I think that's setting yourself free artistically.
That's so interesting to me. Come to think of it, I've never paid attention to physical form of anything. It's as if I gloss over that, right? There's so much around us in our environment, in physical spaces that we occupy. But when we look at things, we don't look at their physical form. And
Yeah.
what you just said resonates with me so much, because I'm pretty sure if I started to notice it more, I would discover so much, not just about artistic, visual, or expression, but probably about myself as to where I pay attention
Yes.
and, where my gaze goes.
100%. And how much of that gaze is socially imposed. You can start to disarm some of those things, how much of it has to do with the mental state you're in at that moment, and so on.
Hmm.
It's like a big mirror. The world is a big mirror to your internal world. And I think
Hmm.
there's like a feedback loop that happens when you start to pay attention to how you're engaging in the world, or how the world engages with you. I think, for example, like, this is going to sound really strange, but sometimes when I have to, when I have a free moment or I have to wait, like, one thing that like a game that I play with myself is I look at a space and I'll close my eyes and try to remember if I recall what I was just looking at. Like, do I
Ah,
know what's in this living room right now? And I will realize often that I don't know things that I have engaged with every day for a year. I don't know where they are. I don't know what painting is there. I can't remember what was on the floor. And I try then open my eyes and look at the things that I missed and try to pay attention to the things that I do notice and why, and pay more attention to the things I missed, and so on. And I think that is something that allows me the opportunity to get in the mind state of being more present,
hmm.
noticing more, um, and thinking through what that could mean about who I am and where I am emotionally at that time. And I think that kind of creative thinking, or um, inner expression, doesn't have to necessarily be on canvas for it to be kind of the rite of passage of human artistry.
Right, right.
Yeah.
What does it tell you about people that you work with? If you were to go through this exercise with somebody else, right? When you see someone not noticing things around them, what does it indicate to you about their human conditioning?
I think it says a lot about where your values are at that time, or what you perceive to be most important in your life at that moment. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's more so the noticing part that's really magnificent, right? Maybe I don't notice my home at all because my mind is on my children, or I don't
Yeah.
notice my children at all because my mind is focused on my health issues, or maybe I haven't looked at my hands in a while. For instance, I had a very clear thought the other day while I was driving, and I noticed my hand on the steering wheel. And I realized that it looked different than the last time I remember looking at my hand, which means that it's been years since I've paid attention to my own hand.
Oh,
And it was this like very vivid moment. And it was an important moment for me because I want to be present for my life, and I want to see, and I want to be on the journey with my body as it changes and grows old and things like that. That's important, a value to me. And so what you notice and so on, I think can say a lot about where you are in that time in your life, and maybe where you want to go. Where you do want your attention to go, where you do want your time to be spent.
As I'm thinking about this, I'm pretty sure there are moments in our lives where we subconsciously avoid looking at things closely, right? Because we don't want to be disappointed in a way, or we've been conditioned to see ourselves in a certain light. And if we look too closely, we'll find something that we don't want to reconcile with.
100%. I think that there's a lot of self-protection that goes on. We do a lot to hide from the things that will hurt and will cause pain. And I think sometimes we're not ready to face some of those things. Sometimes we don't have the capacity because we're in sort of survival mode. And other times it can be a matter of really exploring what you think your tolerance is for pain. If you're able to face something and feel that pain, like, do you feel 100% certain that you will make it out the other side, that you will feel it and survive after and be able to tolerate that pain? I think that's something
Oh
that
my
we
gosh. Yeah.
all kind of
Yeah.
struggle with. There's a massive avoidance of pain.
Pain.
And
Pain.
doesn't that make sense, right?
Yeah, but it's as if certain cultures are so averse to pain and tolerating pain. It's almost as if we are erasing one human emotion and feeling out of our lives because we have associated so much negativity with it. Pain doesn't have to be painful.
Or having something be painful doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have a negative impact on your life, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Painful in a negative way.
Painful in a
Exactly.
negative way. Like, it sounds strange to say it, but sometimes pain can lead to lots of other doors and other pathways and other opportunities and so on. I think you're right in saying that some of this is cultural, right? And I imagine all cultures have some version of this, but for me, I perceive this, right? My perception of this is that cultures that have historically had a lot of systemic trauma and a lot of, just the trauma of immigration to begin with and all of that. I think you try to focus on making your home a joyful place, or, making sure that there's always music playing and so on, and focusing in on the elements of the culture that are positive. Not all families do this, but certainly mine did. And that was in some ways wonderful, right? But in other ways, it made it clear, like I received the message that this was not the space to talk about depression or sadness or anxiety or any of those things, because we simply didn't have time for it in our
Yeah.
existence. Yeah, that's how
Yeah.
that's how I perceived it. That we were not allowed time to have those feelings. I realize now that there is time and there is space in my life, both for joy and for pain,
Mm.
and that sometimes, even for example, like anxiety and excitement can feel exactly the same in your body. And so
Yeah.
there are a lot of commonalities to the way we already can survive through a lot of these experiences of pain.
Yeah. Oh, wow, Delsy, you and I could go on and on about this. This is such an important conversation for me because as you and I are speaking, in my mind, I'm having these moments of pause and introspection and thinking through this conversation in real time. Uh, but I guess sometimes good things have to come to an end. And as we wrap up this conversation, if you were to define the United States of America in the context of how it deals with pain, how would you do that?
I think that the United States rewrites pain. I think that we, as a country, make a concerted effort to rebrand pain in a way that is helpful to whoever is the person who's looking at that moment. I think when you think about how history has been rewritten, or the laws that are being passed to stop children from having access to information about things that were painful, for example, books that are banned because they talk about things that are painful, even things we're not allowed to talk about culturally at the dinner table because they might be painful. We put our own spin on it culturally here in the US, right?
Not for everyone, though.
Not for everyone. Not for
We
everyone.
protect the dominant population from experiencing pain and shame.
I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. And I think it also is a good way of reminding myself, because when you said the US, we as the US, like that's where my mind went. And maybe that's an important thing for me to think about, because at this point, we are also a dominant culture here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. Where can people find the podcast, your work, Delsy? Is there a website they can go to?
Yes. So if you are into wellness, social justice, empowerment, then you might be into Tamarindo Podcast, and you can find us at tamarindopodcast.com. You can also find us on Instagram at Tamarindo Podcast. And then if you're really interested in art in particular, I also have a podcast that I host alone that is called Ocu-Pasión, and that's Ocupasion. And this is on Ocu-Pasión Podcast.com and Instagram at Ocu-Pasión Podcast. And so these are the places that you can listen and kind of connect with me. I love DMs. Let's talk.
Thank you so much, Delsy. This was wonderful.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you for making the time.